Another thing that's very appealing, I think, about the story you tell, which usefully complexifies our usual science-religion narrative, is that in addition to talking about how Descartes, in important ways, had still certain medieval premises. He was very involved in theology. He had to figure out how God fit into his system and could somehow ratify his method.
Come up with proofs for the existence
but
of God.
we also find among these scientists, I mean, many of them, these great figures in the history of science, all of these curious and to us pseudo-scientific interests that were very much in the air at the time. I mean, things like, as you were saying, seances and spiritualism, phrenology. That's an important part of your story too. So how does Descartes' legacy play into that sort of strictly scientific set of developments?
When just going back to you have the idea for a book, and you're basically hoping that the facts are going to bear it out. And in fact, the story of Descartes' bones is a series of maybe 5 or 6 or 7 different stories from 1650 to really now almost, in which people are using his bones or stealing them or parading them or something. And over again, it's back, this same thing is happening, where there's some sort of mix of scientific and religious metaphors or uses to which they're putting them, or political. The next period is during the French Revolution, when so the bones are buried for the second time, as I said, in the church of Sainte-Geneviève in Paris, right next to the remains of the patron saint of Paris. And then they basically stay put for a century. And that's a century of unparalleled discovery and invention, the Enlightenment, and the French Revolution comes about. And the revolutionary government decides, so there's the church in which the bones are buried is falling into decay. And they start building a new one, an enormous temple for the bones of Sainte-Geneviève. It takes about 30 years. And by the time it's finished, just when the revolution happens, and of course the French Revolution was a revolution against the church as well as the state. And so they requisition it, and they decide, again, this is the same theme, that they decide to take it and make it into a secular temple of great heroes of France. This is the Pantheon. And so they start, and it's fascinating reading the records of the revolutionary government and how they, it's chaos in the streets, but they're stopping and having debates about people. Basically, the only person, Voltaire was the only one who didn't, he kind of went in, everybody agreed Voltaire should go into the Pantheon. But they're debating these figures from French history, and should their bones go into this secular temple to be sort of secular relics. And then Descartes comes up, and he is conveniently just across the square. This goes on with some people saying, yes, Descartes was, they're actually drawing a line, saying Descartes started all this in science and also in the political sphere, and look at where it's brought us. Like every generation, they saw themselves, of course the revolutionaries, as the end point of history, and so they saw this line from him to them. And then there was a camp that said, no, actually, and this is a standard rap too, that Descartes is one of this sort of cerebral top-down thinker, and he's actually retarded French science. Whereas the British, one of the things that happened in that century is the British, who were much more kind of hands-on and let's just tinker and experiment and create new ceramics and things like that. Right. They kind of took science and ran with it. So there were the French who were saying, no, Descartes is the one who got us.
I see, that he was a bad model for French science.
Yeah, exactly. So there was this debate in the midst of the revolution over whether they should put the bones of Descartes into the Pantheon. This is a way in which philosophy is this arid academic thing, but it's also to do with our physical beings, the conundrum that we have these thoughts and our bodies die, and we all struggle with that. And here's someone who thought, in this archetypal way, thought about these things, and then his own being, his own physical remains, become a vehicle for telling these stories. So all of that, it has to do with why I decided on 240 pages. I don't think I answered your question.
No, but it was useful pushing us forward because two, I mean, you broadened the discussion more than that in a way too, to use this episode, all of these interesting characters, as a way to discuss modernity as such, what it means to be modern, where we get our ideas of the modern self, of autonomy, of rights, and things like that. And I mean, I thought your take again was very interesting in talking about different approaches to the Enlightenment and understandings of the Enlightenment and how your story plays into that.
Yeah, there's the very simplistic notion that there was the theological worldview, and then along came people like Descartes and Francis Bacon, and then there was the Enlightenment and the secular worldview, which was in opposition to it. And of course, that's absurdly simplistic. But how do you, how do you, just as you go about your day, how do you grapple with these things? And I leaned heavily on Jonathan Israel, the scholar who talks about two enlightenments, a radical enlightenment and a moderate enlightenment. And you can look at the French and American revolutions as kind of epitomizing these two different enlightenments. The French was, and it's interesting living in Europe too, because Europeans, these differences are so striking. How Europeans look at the French Revolution still as like that's the ball game, and the American Revolution is this odd little sideshow. And here it's completely
this bloody awful thing.
Yeah, here it's complete. Yeah, but they're right in the sense that if you want to have a complete revolution, well, the French Revolution was we're going to burn down the churches and we're going to murder the priests, as well as the monarchs. Whereas the American Revolution was a much more measured affair. And something I said in the book is it's unthinkable, the idea that General Washington and his troops would have marched up and down the East Coast burning churches. I mean, that's the difference between the two. And in a way, that's the difference between these two versions of the Enlightenment. You had these radical, the free thinkers, who said, and who are still among us, Christopher Hitchens, for example, who said, and Hitchens says, religion is part of the infancy of our species, and we're grown-ups and we have to move past that. And then there are others who say, and I put myself in this category, who say, that science comprehends a certain band of the spectrum. It doesn't comprehend everything. That's why we have art, and that's also why we have religion. And I find that people like Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, when they're doing their diatribes, they often are focused on the trappings, on religion as it tries to maintain power and assert itself, rather than on the idea and at the level of philosophy.
Right. So Descartes for you and the tensions that he represents is an answer in a way to these fundamentalist tendencies on both sides that we see marching along.
Well, Descartes, for me, I mean, some people who reviewed the book, maybe including some people in this room, seem to think that I was, championing Descartes as the over and above whoever, Spinoza or Galileo or someone. And that wasn't my intention. I don't care that, maybe I think Spinoza was a better philosopher, Descartes was a better writer. But really, to me, what was interesting was this metaphor. I mean, people didn't do that with Spinoza's bones. If they had, I would have maybe gone that way. This metaphor, the way the first generation saw him, and then how that translated into the way they actually used his bones, and a way to tell a story.